Hi, everybody. Welcome. I know there are people still joining us. I'm super excited to have you all on today. Thank you for registering and for making the time and for joining us today. So I'm going to hand it off. Gracias a todos por estar aquí. Es un placer. Gracias por hacer ese espacio para estar aquí con nosotros, registrarse. Voy a pasarle la voz a Gabriela Márquez, que va a hablar un poquito sobre la interpretación y va a dar una pequeña bienvenida de parte de Bitwork.
Hola a todos, gracias por estar con nosotros el día de hoy. Thank you everyone for joining on today. Today's webinar will be bilingual, and so we do have simultaneous interpretation happening at this moment, and that information to log in is on the chat box. Les recordamos que el día de hoy este seminario digital será interpretado en español y las instrucciones para eso están en el chat. Again, I want to welcome you all for joining. My name is Gabriela, and I'm with the Attention Watch Network. And I want to thank Latinx Therapist Action Network for reaching out to us at DWN to be able to create the space and now open it up to such a wide audience. After doing part one, I think it was very clear of the need of being able to see spaces like these. And so we're super grateful to Francisca, to the Latinx Therapist Action Network, and to our panelists today for being able and available to us to share their conocimiento, their knowledge, and their skills on such a critical topic in this moment for us. I just want to share very briefly that at Detention Watch Network, we are a coalition of individuals and organizations that are fighting to end immigrant detention, and currently invite folks that if you're not already plugged in to join the efforts to free all folks who are currently detained, to return to our communities, to come back to our communities and to our homes. And we invite you to check out our website for that information and for ways that you can connect, plug in, and support local efforts that are working with our local members and organizations leading these efforts. So again, thank you, Francisca, thank you, Aida, thank you, Griselda, and Anna for being available to share such again, an important piece for us.
Thank you. So I just wanted to, again, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We'll have a few more folks trickling in. We have planned for about an hour and 15 minutes. And so we hope that you don't hop off. We know folks have pretty busy schedules, but we will be sending this out again as a recording after, in case you have to. Second thing is, again, my name is Francisca Porches Coronado. I am the founder and coordinator of the Latinx Therapist Action Network. And just to tell you a little bit about what it is we are a national network that is also a member of the Detention Watch Network. And we were founded specifically to both be in political and spiritual and moral solidarity with the immigrant rights movement in this country. And second, to be able to offer these types of educational tools, resourcing, and the building of resilience of our movement. We feel very much a part of it. And the way we do that is through sharing some of the tools and skills and knowledge and wisdom that folks who are members, who are mental health practitioners, have gained over many years of practice, and who are eager to be able to connect and play a role within the broader movement for immigrant rights in this country. So this webinar today is an offering for us to be able to make to you all. And so two things. You can learn more about us at the Latinx Therapist Action Network.org. And you could also you could also follow us on social media, the same, Latinx Therapist Action Network. And then also follow Detention Watch Network. We are here because movement's here, because we feel committed and in solidarity, and we are fighting as well. So follow Detention Watch Network on social media, and also their campaign to free them all, to really end all detention, not only in this COVID time, but forever. So with that being said, we are going to kick off this webinar. I'm going to hand it over to Griselda.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Francisca, and just wanted to let you all know that on the first slide, where it says Latinx Therapist Action Network and Detention Watch Network, these are both links to the website, so that's just a little shortcut. So we've already been somewhat introduced, but today's presenters are Francisca, who's the founder of LTAN, myself, who works for LTAN, Ana, who's based out of Austin and is the program coordinator for Girasol, and then Ida, who has various roles, but one of which is a private practice through the Median Point in Jamaica Plain, Boston, Massachusetts. So we wanted to kick off today's presentation with just a quick grounding activity. In a moment, I'm going to set a timer for 1 minute. And we encourage you to do either a breathing activity, or these are some alternatives to breathing, including closing your eyes, relaxing your face, loosening your jaw, curling your toes, screaming, sip cold water, or tell yourself that you're worthy. I myself am going to rub some essential oils on myself, and I've taken off my shoes and I'm just going to feel the ground with my feet. So I'm going to start the timer now. Okay, so that was about 1 minute. Just slowly bring yourself back to the presentation. There's no rush. And also feel free throughout the presentation to return to any of these activities as needed, which includes stepping away from the presentation if need be. So this is the agenda for today's presentation. We're going to try to focus less on definitions and focus more on tools and actions and practices. And we'll be starting by, talking about how this is not just individual, but collective grief and vicarious trauma that we're going through. And then, we'll be defining some terms, going through stages and types. And like I said, emphasizing tools and actions. So the objectives are what we hope you get out of today's presentation. We recognize that in the audience today, there are numerous Latinx mental health workers, organizers, family members of individuals in detention, individuals in mixed status families. And although there are things that are universally felt during this time, our loss and grief looks and feels different than that of the general population. Our losses and grief do not alarm people in power, and yet again, our community works tirelessly to support each other. In addition to coping with these realities, we also face restrictions to our mobility and our ability to join together. We are forced into a hyper-individualistic situation. For the people in this audience and our family members, capitalism forces us to keep working, keep making money. There's essential workers who face contamination, and we are mourning a lot of losses. And trauma and grief and healing are all political. We're doing politicized healing all the time. Similarly, as we support our communities harshly impacted by this pandemic, the risk of vicarious trauma is high. Grief and vicarious trauma can be closely connected. Both relate to our survival. Grief and trauma are both intergenerational and compounded. With grief and trauma, there is loss. You can't have trauma without grief, but you can have grief without trauma. So our goal as individuals and as community is to have these tools so that we can step away from a crisis mode and cultivate our internal and collective resources so that we can all build resiliency. In today's presentation, we'll look at grief and vicarious trauma from a pre, during, and post-intervention point. People recognize signs, but ensuring people can be aware now and managing those signs of grief or vicarious trauma, wherever you land on the spectrum, because of course this looks different for every single person. We each have our own baseline, and each person's baseline or signs of trauma or grief are all okay. So we're starting just by naming how we might be feeling right now. These are just some examples of feelings. And there are many ways to check in with how you're feeling. One thing that I like to do is to just close my eyes and see where in my body I might have certain sensations, and then see if there's a word that matches that sensation in my mind or my body. And so we invite you to use the chat if you want to share one or two words and how you're feeling in this moment. And it's okay if there's no words coming to mind. And you can also use the chat and to say how you're feeling throughout the presentation. And I invite you at the end to check in again to see, after you've received all this information, how everything's landing on you. Okay. So, as I said, this is both individual and collective, and there's this global moment of trauma and grief right now, and there's a lot of buzzwords about mental health issues going on around right now. And so here's a graphic that we liked to sort of like outline how coronavirus is impacting mental health issues. So just a few of them is that there's despair, fear for loved ones' lives. There's decreased financial security, increased loneliness and isolation, and withdrawal. One crucially unique way this pandemic impacts us is the shift from turning outward to turning inward for safety. For individuals who are internally destabilized for any reason, the retreat inward can be very frightening. And what makes things harder to grapple with also are inconsistent messages which we are receiving in this moment. This virus does not affect all of us the same, and for each of us, we may weave in and out of despair, anxiety, relief, and it's all okay. Because trauma and grief works in waves and triggers, we may have different levels of stress next week than we do right now, or in an hour versus right now. And that is all okay. And so I'll move on. So these are some questions that Francisca and I wanted to pose to the group, because there are a lot of people in this audience who are crisis responders, and it can be harder to be in tune with our own unique needs. And so these are, and feel free to chime in, Francisca, if you want to, but these are questions that you can reflect on right now or journal about later or talk about amongst your community or your support network. And these questions are, how is this global moment affecting you? What have you noticed in yourself over time? And over time can be, last year compared to now, or in the last week, the past 2 months. What needs is your body asking you to meet? So now I'm going to pass it over to Anna.
Thanks, Griselda. Hi, everyone. So as I mentioned earlier, my name is Ana Hernandez, and I want to start us off with some basic terms. As Griselda mentioned, we're not going to spend all of the time kind of on definitions, but we do want to give ourselves a sort of baseline to start out with and some shared knowledge and shared terminology so that when we get to tools and strategies, we can really place them in a context that addresses some of what you might be feeling and some of what you might be needing, specifically in the context of understanding vicarious trauma and grief. So let's start by talking a little bit about what vicarious trauma is. So one thing that might come up is some confusion around all the words that get thrown out and how we understand them as distinct things that we experience. So trauma, secondary trauma, vicarious trauma, burnout, these are different concepts that we want to make sure that we're not bringing all in as one thing that can then become confusing to experience. And so vicarious trauma and secondary trauma are sometimes used interchangeably. That's what we're going to focus on today. But I just want to validate that you also might experience something that looks more like trauma, a situation that overwhelms your ability to cope. And in your work, you might experience burnout, which looks more like an exhaustion, a stressor that comes from your context or your setting. But let's talk today specifically about vicarious or secondary trauma. As we have here, what that looks like is, sorry, we'll go back. What that looks like is stress or a process of change that results from chronic exposure to or practice with populations that are vulnerable or suffering. And so it's affected by the people and the topics that you're working with every day. Another way to frame it that comes from Bruce Perry, who does a lot of trauma work, is the traumatic impact on those who feel the intensity of a traumatic event through another person. And so for all of you, you're likely working in a context that is heightened in the potential of dealing with traumatic content, whether that's constant ICE enforcement, whether that's entering oppressive spaces like detention centers, whether that's having an increased trauma content around all of the different barriers that immigrants in this country face. And as folks who are immigrants themselves, as folks who work with immigrants, you're constantly coming into contact with different forms of violence and oppression that can oftentimes lead to trauma. And usually when we talk about vicarious or secondary trauma, we're talking about what happens to someone who wants to give help to people and communities, whether that's their own or others that have experienced or experiencing trauma, and the ways in which that then affects us. And so as you can imagine, and if you heard our last webinar around trauma, our brains are constantly taking in signals from all around us. And since we're so good at surviving as humans, a lot of what we're cued to really respond to are signals of danger. And so when we work in these environments where we're constantly facing different forms of threat and interacting with content that has a lot of potential to traumatize ourselves and the people we work with, we're likely to start to get that chronic exposure that might lead us to having those symptoms of secondary or vicarious trauma. And a lot of us aren't used to noticing how we feel in our bodies and aren't used to having strategies for moving stress through our bodies to get us back to that sense of safety, to get us out of danger. And we also may live and work in contexts where actually we can't even attain full safety, right? When you live under constant threat of ICE, complete safety is not possible. So that just preps us, right, to have some of these responses, to have that empathy that we're so good at using and that connects us to one another get stretched to a point where then we start to really internalize some of those threats and some of that trauma. And some of the changes we notice from that might be really subtle and you don't even realize it's happening. Sometimes it might be something that you and the people who love you notice over time. But how we're impacted by our work in the present affects the way that we work and interact with folks in the future. And the point of talking about vicarious trauma is that it influences our inner world, right? It influences our inner life and our experiences with other people. It's something that we internalize. So some of the pieces that we think about in terms of healing is understanding how we need to have a continuous effort to notice how the work is affecting us, to notice how our circumstances and environment are affecting us, different forms of violence and oppression are affecting us, and realize that secondary trauma or vicarious trauma is going to need attention and some work and some intentional steps in order to make sure that we're moving that stress through our bodies, that we're not ending up in a situation where we have such an internalized, changed aspect of how we see the world. One way I've heard this frame that's really helpful is that concept that by the time you're thirsty, you're already dehydrated. So by the time we notice some of these trauma symptoms, secondary trauma symptoms, it's already been in our bodies for a while, right? And so today we're going to provide a lot of hope around tools and strategies you can use. This isn't something that you have to live with forever or something that, you know, we're saying is necessarily even something we want to pathologize, but it's something we want to bring forward as a thing a lot of us work with. And so I want to go to the next slide and think about how all of this might intersect, because all the definitions you just saw on the screen, the question is, what if I might have all of these things? Is that possible? And the answer is yes. The short answer is yes. So we want to acknowledge the high prevalence of trauma in the world, and whether that be something from childhood or something more recently, it's very likely a lot of us have experienced something that may have caused direct personal trauma to ourselves. And partly because of capitalism, we'll go back to that system and the way that it functions in society, a lot of our workspaces might lead us to burnout. A lot of our environments might not support our well-being. And then when we work on social justice work, we are at a higher rate likely of engaging with topics and issues and settings that might lead us to have experiences of secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. And so this is something that might feel confusing. It's something that, you know, it's normal to wonder if what's coming up for me is that getting triggered back to that trauma experience, is that my vicarious trauma, secondary trauma from the work I do, or am I just so exhausted because I haven't had time off in a year? You know, what is that? And it might be that it's coalescing and there's multiple pieces affecting your well-being, but it's really helpful to be able to piece apart these definitions and start to help in terms of your own healing to know how to address some of these different pieces for yourself so that you also can name them, right? Naming, identifying, and making meaning of things is part of what we're going to talk about today. And that's part of what helps us to engage in healing work that we can actually be super intentional about and that meets our own unique needs. And so to wrap up this section on vicarious and secondary trauma, I really want to go into helping us validate and identifying some of these symptoms, some of these signs that might tell us, hey, this might be a little bit of a piece around secondary vicarious trauma. This might be how we notice that. So we have a list here, and this is not a fully exhaustive list, but it's just to kind of help us name things, right? That helps us kind of make it tangible, something we can hold on to, something that feels less nebulous or confusing. And I just want to share some things that you might notice that relate to some of these symptoms that, you know, affect the work. And so some of the things that might come up for you is if you have difficulty distinguishing your experience from the traumatic experiences of the people you work with. Something else that you might notice is if you see danger or feel more on alert in places or settings that may not have felt dangerous to you before or threatening. Sometimes we notice because we're struggling to be creative in ways that we're used to and used to be easy. Diminished creativity sometimes is a sign. Feeling pessimistic about your work all the time or feeling like you can't help everyone and that feeling really hopeless is something that might be a sign. And another one is feeling like it's hard to receive support or not wanting to decrease your workload if someone's suggesting that. So these are things that you might just get curious about and just ask yourself, where is this coming from? Might this be a sign that I need to start getting some help, that I might need to start engaging in some of these different practices? And as we're going to talk about when we talk about tools and strategies, the idea here is not that we wait until it's horrible and then we like do one thing to fix it and then we're good. It's all about integrating different strategies and approaches on a daily, on an hourly, on a minutely basis, when we actually are able to be in tune with our own bodies and our own minds and be able to meet our needs on a regular basis. So it's about doing that integrating work on a regular basis and being able to identify when we're feeling some of these ways and knowing what to do to help ourselves. So that's a journey, that's a process, but that's kind of the goal, right? Is that there's not one quick fix. It's something that we do over time. And so as we transition into talking about grief, which as you might imagine, and as we said, Love pointed out, is very linked to vicarious or secondary trauma. I just invite you, if you would like in the chat, to kind of share which one of these words really struck you the most. Something that you related to, something that you've seen in other people, something that you see in the movement, that you might want to name as something that, you know, you're curious to think about how we can do some healing work around. So I see starting to come in diminished creativity, inability to empathize, guilt and anger, hopelessness, cynicism, and just naming that a lot of these are going to seem like they overlap, and that makes sense, right? And we can have and experience multiple at a time. I also see dissociation here a lot, and the last thing I want to name before we move forward is that so much of these responses are protective. Our brains are so good at protecting us. And sometimes that can be painful or confusing. Dissociation, for example, can feel like you're so disconnected. And usually that's a protective piece, right? That's trying to guard us from pain. And so I just want to name that our bodies are smart. And so they're doing all these strategies and we're here to listen to them and to help them. So I'm going to pass it over to Iva to give us some information about grief. And I appreciate everyone sharing here in the comments.
Hello, everyone. One thing I also want to note, if you're in the chat, some people are only answering to the panelists. That's totally fine. But if you want everyone to see it, make sure that you click so that everyone else can see, because we're getting all the juicy bits. And if that's on purpose, great. But if it's not, just a heads up. So I'm here to talk a little bit more about grief, one of the things that binds us all, because we will all have loss. It doesn't matter what kind of loss it is. We will all lose things, whether it's people, whether it's safety, whether it's bodily autonomy, integrity, abilities, all these things. And so grief, when we want to define it, we can talk about it as our varied reactions to some kind of loss. And sometimes people talk about grief as, oh, if it's sadness, or oh, it's distress, or it's, you know, suffering. And grief can actually be way more than that. And that's one of the things that I'm excited to talk about, because for some people, grief is rage, grief is anger, grief is feeling really numb and feeling like you're dead inside. And often we feel a lot of these things at the same time, in a row, but there's not a one particular way of doing it, right? So, and I'll talk a little bit later about this idea of stages or tasks, but the main thing I want people to get away from this is grief is a shapeshifter, in the words of my colleague Bianca Laureano, an amazing Afro-Latina scholar and intellectual who I want to kind of specifically bring in here, because a lot of us are on the lighter end of the spectrum, and bringing the voices of Afro-Latinidad is really important when having these conversations. And so the idea that grief can be so many things is really important, because often we don't recognize that we're grieving. We don't recognize that there's a loss that we've had, because we assume that it has to look like sadness, and that's not it. Another piece that's really important is that grief is often pathologized. It's often treated as a disorder, as a problem. And I'm not saying grief has to be fun, but that grief does have wisdom and something to teach us. And so I want to read out a quote by Earl Grolman, very brief. "Grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It's an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. It's the price you pay for love, and the only cure for grief is to grieve." Another quote that I really like and extremely resonates by Jamie Anderson is that grief is love with no place to go. It's all the love you want to give but can't. All that unspent love gathers up in the corners of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in that hollow part of your chest. Part of what I like about that quote is that it's so visceral. It's where the grief is located. It's in your throat, it's in your body, it's in your belly. And one of the manifestations of grief is also physical pain, right? If we think of heartbreak, heartbreak has some of the same effects as if you actually were being punched or stabbed, anything bodily that we would sometimes give more attention to than emotional pain. But as some of us know, and I think all of us know on the panelist end of things, the body and the mind are actually connected. They're one. There's not this division of which one is in pain. Both of them are in pain kind of at the same time, right? So I've been experiencing a lot of grief lately, very recently, as my panelists know. And that quote of "grief is love with no place to go" is really resonating. And it sounds like for a couple of the attendees as well. And so one of the things that I want to move us toward, right, is, okay, if grief is love with no place to go, what do I do with that? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. But we want to look at grief as an opportunity and as a process and something that binds us all as humans. Next slide. So overwhelming slide, a lot of types of grief, not going to talk about all of them. The main thing I wanted to share with folks is that there are a lot of different kinds of grief, right? And so if we only think that there's one kind, we will often not recognize that we are grieving, because we have only one model for what grief is. So a couple that I want to just name, and it's fairly easy to Google some resources on these if you want more information. We are happy to provide more as well. The one, first type of grief, normal grief, grief that does not necessarily lead you to your life going completely down the tubes. It is grief that is usually related to some identifiable event. It comes in waves. So you might feel really sad at one point, but then you can kind of do things during the day, especially as the days go on, and you're still feeling kind of human. Anticipatory grief is anxiety, really. Anticipatory grief is the kind of grief where we're waiting for some loss. The loss has not yet happened, but it's starting to creep in. So we see that a lot when people are scared of getting deported. They're anticipating that loss. When we have someone who's dying of a terminal illness, we see and anticipate that loss. Disenfranchised grief is another kind of grief where societally we are told that our grief is unacceptable because that is not a loss at all. Right? So for example, now still, but especially when same-sex marriage was not legal or same-gender marriage was not legal, the idea of mourning for a partner that was not in a heterosexual partnership with you was disenfranchised. And so everyone who lost a partner in that kind of setup, society told them, that's not a problem. That's not grief. Why are you so upset about it? So grieving for people who died of AIDS when AIDS and HIV were really more stigmatized than they are now, even, also disenfranchised grief. For some people, pets dying is disenfranchised grief because a lot of people don't see pets as important to someone's life or meaningful enough. We also have collective grief, which is the grief of an entire community. And so a lot of migrant communities were facing grief right now. When Huracán Maria and hurricanes devastated Puerto Rico, there was collective grief on the island and across the diaspora. So the idea of collectivity is that a lot of people at the same time are experiencing either the same event or the same kind of event, and are all having some grief reactions to it, some loss that is bigger than just individual, right? If my pet dies, that's my grief. If there's an earthquake on the island where I grew up, that's a different kind of grief. Still really hard, but a different name for it. And then finally, we have complicated varieties that can include traumatic, that can include, inhibited, all these different ones. And the idea behind those is that those are usually longer lasting and more intrusive to your life. Those are way harder to deal with on a daily basis. They might make you flare up if you have a mental disorder or mental health condition. They might make you unable to work. They might make you unable to speak. So anything that's more complicated, we might lump into that category. Next slide. So a lot of people know the stages of grief. And the main thing I want to say is they're important, but they don't go in a line. So please don't think it's linear. So grief is not linear. Healing is also not linear. So there's not one thing you have to do before another thing. Often we think that there's a roadmap that we have to follow. There isn't. There's a lot of maps, a lot of ideas. And as we have tools, we can decide what map works for us. And that's what we're trying to do in the latter part of our presentation. So we hope you stick around for that. The main thing I want to say about tasks, right? So moving from stages, which are more feelings like anger, bargaining, despair, or depression, I want us to move to action, right? So what do we have to do with grief to actually process it? Here are some, not by me, by J. William Warden, but the tasks are to accept the reality, experience the pain. We can't not feel the feelings, y'all. Even if they're really hard, we gotta feel the feelings. Then we have to adjust to the environment where the loss has occurred, right? In this case, it says without your loved one, but it can just be without the thing that you have lost, whether it's a loved one or an identity or an idea. And then you have to reinvest in the new reality. So you have to start putting effort in and putting love in and putting resources in to this new life that doesn't have the person in the way that they used to be, right? So when we look at all these different tasks, we can actually start moving toward healing, which is actually a great segue because now we're moving into, so what do we do? Now that we know some of the tasks, some of the words, tell us the tools. And I think Anna is going to kick us off.
Yes, awesome. Let's get started. So we were able to see your feedback from registering, and as we expected, a lot of you were like, yes, these are things I experience. What do I do with them? What do I do about them? What's next? So we wanted to spend as much time as possible on that. So I want to actually bring us back to what we talked about at the beginning with that idea of what I'm feeling. And if we go to the next slide, we have the follow-up to that. So if you will kind of go back to remembering that moment where you typed into the chat what you were feeling, what I'd like to invite you to do now is think, when I feel that, when I feel dissociated, when I feel confused, when I feel grief, when I feel what have you, what do I need? And just take a minute or so to look at these lists, to see what resonates with you. And let's type in the chat, what are we needing, right? With the feels that we have right now. We felt into them, but sometimes that in of itself, as Ida was saying, we want the action piece after that, which is very human and very important. And so this kind of helps us to start to name some of that. So I see some ideas starting to come in: humor, guidance, finding meaning, needing nature, needing space, play, companionship, community, sleep, laughter, hope, stimulation, closeness. It's pouring in. And as you look at the chat, what I'd love for you to do is just notice what it feels like to see these words compared to seeing the feeling words. A lot of those feeling words were heavy, and a lot of what we're feeling right now is really hard. And so I just want to notice for all of you, take a look at that chat and think, what does it feel like to see what we need and to just read these words that bring us so much joy and positivity, and to feel that someone else said the word I needed too, right? And that we're all connected through our needs. So just take a minute to internalize that, and know that, you know, as we go through this, I think being able to name some of those needs, we may not have always taught that our needs mattered, that they were important, that we could identify them. So naming them is the first step. And then we're going to talk a little bit more about connection and community. But just knowing that we have resources within ourselves and between each other to start to meet those needs. Go for it, Iva.
All right, I got you. Someone asked in the chat a good question that we can't copy paste, so I'll just say it out loud. Someone asked, would you say that right now we're experiencing disenfranchised, collective, and anticipatory grief with COVID-19? Absolutely, and probably a couple more too, because this is a mass event, right? There's a lot of denial of what's happening. So absolutely, a lot of those, but not, you know, for some people it might not be disenfranchised. They might live in a community where they do get recognition for the loss, but in a lot of places we are not getting that. So just a heads up on that. In terms of, again, what to do, thank you for that question. We're wired for ritual and connection. We are social mammals. We need other people and other beings, whether they're on this plane or another one. And so what grief can do if left untreated and unchecked and unhandled is isolate us. It makes us feel extremely alone, like we're the only person in the universe that has ever felt this level of despair and pain and rage. And so what we have to do to start metabolizing grief is actually connect. So here are 4 tasks, sort of different from the ones I said before, but related. 4 tasks for grief. We need to move from contempt to compassion. Rather than feeling disgusted or bad at the idea that we have lost something or how badly we feel about it, we need to hold compassion for ourselves and others in it. We have to move from silence to sharing. And sharing doesn't have to be with 20,000 people. Sharing can be with one person. Sharing can be with your journal. Sharing can be with your Facebook audience. But the idea is that it has to come out somehow. And it has to be named and acknowledged, because we can't heal something that we are pretending isn't hurt, okay? So also we need to balance comfort and challenge. There's someone's phone that's ringing, but that's okay. We need to beware, to balance the comfort and challenge so that we're not pushing ourselves too much, but that we're also not falling back on the same things that we've always been using because they might not work, right? So if you're someone who's very social, you might need to isolate a little bit and have some alone time with your grief. If you're someone who wants to keep it really tight to the chest and share your vulnerability with no one, you might want to talk to some folks about it, even if it's hard. That's me. That's my flavor. And then finally, you need to learn to surf. And I don't mean physically surf, though if you know that, you probably have some good skills in this area, but learning to surf the waves of grief, because it is not one and done. You're going to go in and out. And if you expect that grief will be linear, you're going to be disappointed and it'll hurt more, because you'll also be hurting from the whiplash of, oh, I thought I was okay now. I thought I was healed. I thought it was over. And grief doesn't really end like that. It's not like, click, it's done. So the things that we want to be aware of, and this is from another author, Francis Heller or Weller, I forget. He says, beware the sins of amnesia and anesthesia. And what he means by that is often what we do with grief is we forget and we numb. And those are two of the worst things we can do with grief, especially in the long term. This doesn't mean that we have to feel every feeling at every second. Absolutely not. I would never tell you to do that. But you have to feel it at some point. Next slide. So, all right, we're getting into the meaty parts. What are we doing? How do we do this? So one thing in terms of reaching outside and talking about it for grief, here are some examples. One, therapy, right? Therapy is also not necessarily always accessible to everyone. It is not always culturally relevant to everyone, but that's why networks like ours exist, right? That's why we have resources at the end of the presentation for finding non-crappy therapists and having that space where you can have focus and have someone trained to help you with this, okay? Letters. So whenever we experience a loss, if it's a person, sometimes we know that we could write to them and just never send it. But a lot of us don't realize that we can also write letters to events, letters to the earth, letters to things that happened, and letters to our past selves. So, you know, what would you like that person to know? What would you have liked to tell that person if they have died and you can't talk to them anymore in the way that you used to? So again, something where you write it, you put it down. There's also the element here of physicality. If you're writing, you're typing, you're moving your hand, you're doing something that's physical, and it's engaging your body in a different way. Also, death cafes, the idea behind these is that you have a meeting with some facilitation, but no agenda, where you get to just talk about death. Those are not a bereavement group. That's not for processing grief, but that is for getting more acquainted with the idea of death, getting more acquainted with the idea of loss, especially if you come from a place where you just don't talk about it. You just don't think about it. So just starting the conversation before necessarily you've experienced loss is really good. A lot of us don't deal with loss and grief until we're in the middle of it. And while that's okay, if we can preemptively address some of it, that's even better, right? Support circles are another idea here, where you basically form a little pod of people, right? Like, I am a mess right now. Who's going to help me feed myself? Who's going to get me groceries if I'm in bed and I can't get out? And sometimes we don't know who those people are in the moment. And sometimes we can make those lists in advance, right? So one thing I did for some recent grief that I'm holding, I was like, hey, Facebook friends, this is this horrible loss I have just experienced. Just letting people know. And because people know who I am and how I work, a lot of people were like, hey, I'm here to hold space. Here's a meme. Here's a song. If you want to talk about, I got you. And so I was able to share that and get the idea of who could be in my support network. What could people offer? Finally, with this reaching outside, and I'm going intently in this one because we often don't know how to reach out. So these are ideas for how to do so. Again, Bianca Laureano, my friend and colleague, mentioned this hashtag. She has Femme in Mourning, hashtag Femme in Mourning, that she started to do when her mother died. And if you just look through that, you can see her grief process. She was very public about it. And she talks about all the things that she did to grieve. And so if you're looking for ideas, if you're looking for what could this look like even publicly, right, I would encourage you to check out that hashtag. And it's, again, Latinx person specifically. So there's more cultural relevance for a lot of us in there. Creating structures, habits, and rituals is also really important, because usually what grief does is it's disrupting, and a loss just like cracks into whatever you were doing and just shatters a lot of things, whether it's immediately or shattering slowly over time. And so however you can do ritual, and ritual doesn't have to be something super fancy. Ritual is just, in the words of Francis Weller, any gesture done with an emotion and an intention that attempts to connect to healing and transformation. You don't need a lot to make a ritual happen. And again, we have some resources at the end of what kinds of rituals you can do. One that I really like is I have purchased dissolving paper. And dissolving paper is really neat. You just put it in water. It immediately dissolves with a little bit of shaking. And so I've done grief water, where for collective grief especially, you can buy this paper online very easily, and you have everyone write their grief, or alternatively, you have everyone write what they want to offer everyone else's grief, right? So the words we heard earlier, play, hope, joy, comfort. You have everyone in a circle. They all write on their paper. There's a bowl of water in the center. Everyone drops their dissolving paper in. You have someone stirring the pot. And then at the end, you can choose to say the words before the paper goes in. You don't have to. At the end, everyone takes a little bit of the water home. And so everyone leaves with a little bit of this collective grief physically transformed, or they leave with a little bit of this collective healing in a small vial. You can add food coloring to it if you want to be fancy. You can add glitter. I love doing that, but you do you. But the idea here is transform it, make it something physical rather than just something that lives in one body, right? Related to that, you can make an altar. There's an altar on the slideshow. Again, another one from Bianca, from her grief, particularly around stuff that was going on in Puerto Rico. We're both Boricuas. So, you know, the idea behind an altar is just a dedicated space for grief, remembrance, and ritual, or one of those three. It doesn't have to be about death. But one thing I would encourage is that it be interactive. And that's something that she really focused on. She didn't want it to be this altar that you just stare at and just look at. She wanted it with things that you could hold, things that you could smell, things that you could touch. And again, that's another way of transforming grief, bringing in your senses to it. There's a lot, I don't know if you've had this happen, but I certainly have. There are things that intellectually I don't know are going to make me sad. And then I feel them, or I smell them, or I taste them, and I'm right back in that grief or in that trauma. And similarly, there are things that I can eat or drink or touch that feel incredibly healing, right? When the hurricanes were happening, I had arroz con gandules, and I was like, oh, this is healing me from the inside out. And I made it myself. It reminded me of home, and it was bittersweet, but those are the kinds of things that we often don't think about as healing in a mainstream way, but we certainly know in a lot of our cultures that those are forms of healing. Next slide. So there we go. We were already talking about it, connecting to ancestral and cultural practices. So things like, if you have a particular religion, I know some of us here on the panelists and practice various forms of, you know, whether it's Ifa or spirituality or spiritismo or different sort of practices. Is there something that you can connect to from your family, from your culture, even if you didn't have a connection to it before, right? It is always okay to start a new practice. You don't have to have been born necessarily with it to be able to access it, okay? With cultural humility, obviously. The embodiment strategies, I want to show one here real quick. Again, anything that makes you connect to your body, because a lot of us live up here in the brain or disconnect from our bodies, whether it's through gender dysphoria, whether it's just being freaking tired, but getting back into the body. I think I mentioned in the chat earlier that when I'm crying, my teeth hurt really badly. And, you know, I'm not going to go into the science of that, but if you too hurt really badly when you're crying, or you have a lot of tension up in the throat, doing a horse lips breath is helpful. And that just basically looks like this. So you kind of let your lips be a little bit puffy and soft, and you just blow through them. You might spit, so be aware of where you're doing it. But the idea here is that this is moving some of the tension away from your jaw. It's creating vibration and sensation that can start to let you unclench. You can also put your hands in your mouth and outside your mouth like this, and start massaging your jaw from inside and outside. These are all practices that colleagues have shared with me, and I'm happy to share with you today. So I didn't make these things up. The other thing real quick to mention is that we can put music and art to it. right? Pain can also be a space for transformation. Grief can be a door. Grief can be a vehicle. And resisting capitalism is important here too, though, right? We don't have to monetize our pain. We don't have to make anything important or beautiful out of our pain. But if we want to, if that might help, we can, okay? That might help. So we are sharing two playlists here. One that I made that is specifically about mourning during the hurricanes in Puerto Rico. There's a little screenshot of some of the songs over there. And so you can access it, it's free. You can sort of see it later. And there's also one from Griselda at bit.ly Canciones de Duelo, which is more about, it seemed like parental grief to me. Griselda, tell me if that's correct. Yes, okay. No, it's not.
But yes and no.
Perfect, my favorite answer.
Grandfather, but also it could be used as parental.
Okay, there we go. So the idea here, right? Find music, make music, get your grief in and out of your body through as many channels as you can, right? It's not just the eyes, it's not just the ears. Not all of these are accessible to all of us anyway, right? But consider how you can do that. Next slide.
I just wanted to add super quick. I nerd out over the science of all of this stuff. And so I just wanted to mention the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in the body. And that's kind of what we're accessing through a lot of this stuff. And so just to name things like swallowing, like water, like think about swallowing cold water and paying attention to how it feels going down, chewing gum, eating a piece of candy. All of these things are ways in which we actually access soothing the vagus nerve, which totally affects our nervous system and how we regulate, how we're able to calm ourselves and soothe ourselves. And so much of that is innate. And if you listen, you'll like want to do those things. But I just want to name that there's like science behind it and there's this ancestral wisdom behind it. And when we bring the two together, it's just beautiful. And so I just wanted to kind of add that piece of the scientific part. And someone kind of put in here like noting feeding our hunger as soothing. And Ida spoke to that, but I want to like further normalize that because there can be so much stigma and shame around like food in all the different ways. And also right now we may be facing scarcity for so many reasons, whether that's truly having a hard time accessing food or whether that's just all the different like COVID pieces around us. And so I just want to like extra super normalize food and feeding ourselves and nourishing ourselves as one of our main tools for soothing and coping, and to just like help us peel back any layers of shame or anything that comes with that, and just like listen to our bodies and listen to our cues and help ourselves engage in some of that, because it is so nourishing and so important and such a key part of healing.
Thank you, Anna. Precisely, right? And this is why we do this collectively, right? We all have something to contribute. And that's, I think, Anna, you actually make a good point here too about bringing in the science. For some of us, we are like, ooh, about science and establishments. And some of us are, ooh, about spirituality. Doesn't matter which way you start it, right? Both are connected, both have ways to get in and interlock with each other. So if you are grieving and you're someone that's more into one or the other, that's fine. If you are supporting someone that is into one more than the other, just frame it for them in the way that makes sense to them, right? If the idea of an altar is going to freak them out, just be like, you know, can you just make a collection of things that you like, just so that you have them in somewhere in your room? There's always ways to make this legible for people. There was a question in the Q&A about supporting others through grief and the experience of witnessing someone you care about go to an earlier stage of grief when they were making progress. Honestly, one of the things that I've found most helpful is to make sure that you and those people are talking about what grief looks like, and that it is a shapeshifter, and that it's not moving backwards, right? Because this idea of progress being linear is honestly part of the problem. And so, you know, to the point here on the slide, going from pathologizing something to normalizing it, validating, this is how grief works, right? That phrase, I mantra it with myself and with my clients. This is how grief works. This is how grief moves. this is normal, this is how it works, right? Rather than, oh, you're failing, or you're not progressing, or you were doing well and now you're not doing well. That's just a lie that we have been told, and it's just not true. But we have to demystify that and give sometimes proof about it. So there's a lot of literature around grief not being linear and healing not being linear. Some of the resources that we have at the end might help with that too, right? Self-care routine rather than triage. The idea here is we shouldn't be rescuing ourselves when we're already feeling really messy. We should have a practice that is preemptively caring for ourselves, because otherwise, again, it's not self-care, it's self-rescue, right? When you're already in trouble or already in pain. And this also relates to the next slide, which I'll talk about in a second as well. But web of support, basically draw out who are your people. And I encourage people to not just make a list, make a set of circles with yourself at the center or the person at the center, and start to draw. Again, the idea here is we want to engage our creativity, because that often brings out ideas that we didn't even think about, right? If we're thinking very linearly and bullet pointed lists, our brain is doing something different than when we are creating and on purpose moving around a page, moving across colors, across fonts. So making a web of support rather than a list can sometimes bring up people that you didn't even think of, or resources that you didn't even think of. Joy and pleasure catalog. Again, this is not necessarily in for a moment of grief. I use them as my happy lists, right? I just have an ongoing tally of what was nice today, or every other week, or once a month. What things was I proud of myself for doing? What are, nice things that happened? Wow, that mango was delicious. Wow, this person was really nice to me on the subway. This thing happened, even if it's really small, because when we're grieving or when we're in trauma mode, we forget like half of those, if not all of them. And so going back to something that you can see, something that you can sort of and feel somehow, is going to be really helpful. So for some people, it's a list. For some people, it's literally a box. It's their joy box. This can have things like pleasure products. I'm a sexuality educator, so I would be remiss if I didn't mention that. But it can also be nice rocks. It can be nice crystals. It can be a nice book. It can be a nice bubble wrap paper, so you can pop it and that feels nice. Doesn't matter. Something that's physical and you can work with. Regular reflections on your work or your situation. So not waiting until the moment of despair to reflect on how things are going. An example that I like to share is that I have a reminder on my phone twice a month saying, if you died in 7 days, how would you feel about your life? And this is just a moment of pause for me to think, am I living the life I want, right? Or should I change something? And even if I can change it in the moment, it's the reminder that you might want to think about that, because we're all going to die. And there was a lot of these memento moris. These were very popular years ago and in many cultures, and a lot of us have lost them. So bringing that back, that reminder of death, not as this necessarily scary thing, but just as hey, a change is coming. What do you want to do before then? Sacred and or safe space, we've already talked a little bit about, but is there a place where you feel safe, right? For some people, it's the woods. For some people, it's their office. For some people, it's the bathroom. Affinity group gathering. So who are your people? How can you gather with them? In this time, it's really messy, right? Because we can't necessarily be in person a lot, but it also opens up possibilities of connecting with people that we didn't realize we could have connected with. Right? There's a lot of you on this right now. There are over 200 folks earlier. And, a lot of us wouldn't necessarily have connected otherwise. And so who are the people you can be in community with, even if they're not physically present at this time? Comforting touch. Damn it, COVID. It's really hard right now, but you can give comforting touch to yourself. So anything that is squeezing or rubbing a safe part of your body, right? For some of us, there's a lot of body parts that do not feel safe. Maybe it's just your finger and you're just holding your finger gently. Babies do this. Babies are really freaking smart for being so damn tiny. So they do these things. We can learn from them. Again, therapy and peer support, right? So it's not always therapy. Sometimes it's a peer that knows about this stuff. Maybe it's a group that knows about this stuff that can really be helpful. But these are all strategies. These are all ways of supporting your mental health during, after, before, at any point of this. Next slide. All right. And this one, again, I'll go a little bit quickly because we want to make sure that we get through everything. And if we have anything else to add from the other panelists, that we get to that. The one I'm just going to scream about, I'm going to yell about this one very gently. We need to reassess work plans to ensure that expectations meet capacity. Okay. And these are about organizational shifts. Okay. These are things that organizations can do. And it doesn't matter if you're the boss, if you're the ED, doesn't matter. The way that you will do these will change based on your sort of position in an organization. You might be the person who does it. You might be the person who requests it. You might be the person who petitions it or drafts it. There's all of us can be involved in this if we're part of an organization. And organizations are also families, just FYI. Doesn't have to be a job, okay? The main thing here, though, is that often when we are in grief and trauma, we want to do everything. We are trying to heal the entire world, and we can't by ourselves. So it's important to remember that we can only do so much, and those limitations are important because the more we stretch them, the worse we are with each individual thing we're doing, right? And so knowing that it is not actually us by ourselves. We are part of a web of healers. There's so many people on this call. Like all of us are healing the world right now. So we don't have to do it alone. We don't have to try to carry it alone, okay? And someone had asked about grandiosity as a symptom of vicarious trauma. Yeah, grandiosity when you're like, I'm gonna do all of it. You're gonna burn out, my friend. Been there, done that. You might be there right now. It sucks. So how can we come back from that, right? Someone's like, drag me. I will drag myself here. We need to step back, and saying no is really hard, and saying I can't do that is really hard. And a strategy for that is sometimes to say, this is my boundary. Like I can't say no to this, but what can I say maybe yes to? I get a lot of requests from people saying, hey, can you help me find a therapist? I can't help every person find a therapist. So I made a resource that I can just send people to whenever they ask. And it has information about therapy, and that is my contribution, right? I can feel good about doing something, but not necessarily what initially was requested, all right? And so in a work situation, EDs are sometimes pushing, executive directors are sometimes pushing to do a lot. Sometimes we are pushing to do a lot from the bottom up. And we need to really be critical about how trying to do so much is going to affect the rest of the organization and our own mental health, right? Collectivizing decision-making is another piece that's really important. So if your organization is really hierarchical, that's real. That's a lot of what exists in the world today. It doesn't have to be that way. So look into other models of organizing, look into horizontal base building strategies. There's a lot of people that do this work, and you don't have to overhaul your entire organization overnight. See what small changes you can make to make it more collective, right? When you make a decision, did you have to do it by yourself, or could maybe 1 or 2 or 3 more people have been involved? It takes more time, but it usually leads to better outcomes, right? So that's my pitch for that. Wellness plans for the individuals and collectives, not making that a afterthought or even optional. Thinking from the get-go, what are the healing needs for my people? And how are we gonna know together about those healing needs? Finally, encouraging and anticipating use of leave and vacation times. A lot of us may have vacation time that we never use, or we feel like we can't use, or feel like we are going to be punished for using. So if we are in that position, changing the culture around that, asking questions about leave policies, encouraging our staff to take time off, building that into the capacity question, right? That's going to be important. And then finally, being mindful around stigmatizing language, because that contributes to poor mental health, right? There's a lot of folks who don't know. There's a lot of really amazing literature around microaggressions and the mental health impacts of microaggressions, how that erodes people's mental health and creates collective and personal trauma. So even something as small as that, if you can't do anything else except change your language a little bit, that's still progress and that's still work. So as we're talking about all these things of connecting to each other, I want to pass it off to Anna, who has a couple more thoughts on that front.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Aida, for all of those concrete tools. I know it so helps to have examples and tangible pieces to work with, right? Instead of it being nebulous. One question that I wanted to address that came into the chat that I think is so important is this question about how do we engage in conversations with people and support when we really don't want to talk 24/7 about COVID, but also we want to get like support around our feelings. And I think this question actually also really relates to when we want to just talk about our work in general and how it's making us feel, but we don't want to constantly feel like we're dragging down the conversation or like we're always talking about the same sad thing over and over. Like we've all been there. And so sometimes a metaphor I've used for this is to think about the game hot potato, where I say that like we accidentally hot potato people. So we're holding this thing that's hard to hold, and I'm talking to Aida, and I threw her a hot potato and she caught it because, you know, it's what we do, but it burned her hands, right? And so sometimes we're walking around with these things that are really hard and we accidentally hot potato people because we didn't do this check-in first of like, hey, how you feeling? Do you have mental energy to like put on your oven mitts so I can put on mine and we can each take part of this hot potato together and like hold it and check it out and not burn either of our hands. So having some ability to kind of go into that and check in with each other and get used to that being part of it helps us feel like we have space to share what we're going through and space to hold what other people are going through, but we don't have to feel like so pulled from that, because the thing is, one of the pieces of trauma is that it's sudden, it's unexpected, it yanks us, right? It interrupts us. And so we don't want to kind of accidentally replicate that with one another. We want to lean gently into it and then help make sure we know how to judge our capacity to provide support. So I just want to point us back to that idea of like, when I feel this, I need this. So when you're feeling something, I encourage you to kind of do that exercise for yourself and ask what you need, because we respond so much better oftentimes to like a specific, I need this from you right now, friend or colleague, versus like, here's all my feels, I don't know what to do with them, right? Which sometimes that's just genuine and that's okay. But if we can get into the practice of when I feel this, I need this, we can meet our needs so much better and know who to go to for different things. So I want to move us into this last piece, which is all about what Aida kind of finished us off with, which is connection and support and why we're all here together. I love this quote that if we carry intergenerational trauma, and we do, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom. It's in our genes and in our DNA. And that we really have to think about what collective care looks like. We can critique the concept self-care all day long and all the routes it's gone down, and it's not just a bubble bath, blah, 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 right? But like, I want to move us into this idea of like, how do we get strength from community? How do we connect with one another? What does it actually look like to care for one another through this hard work, through these hard experiences, through some of the trauma, and in a way that actually allows us to move toward liberation and hope and more of this collective healing. And so I just want to invite everyone in the chat to just put a wish that you have for everyone else on this call. So I want to give us just like a pump, like an injection of communal love and care and hope. So if everyone just will put in like what you hope for everyone else, what you want for everyone else, what you're wishing everyone else on this call, and let's just soak up all of this care and love that we have for one another, and know and feel deeply in our bodies that we are not alone today. And we're not alone any day. Oh my God, it's going so fast. My heart is filling up. Look at this.
And there's so many things on there too, because we're getting some of them ourselves, right? So there's laughter, there's smiles, nice flowers. There's a lot of laughter in there, y'all. That's beautiful.
So
Strength
much
and
laughter.
wisdom.
Unconditional love and acceptance. Beautiful. So I know we're at time. I want to pass it to Fran to kind of wrap us out. We do have additional resources that will go out in a handout. So don't worry, even everything we said today, there's more. There's books and websites, things to read, things to listen to. journal prompts. So you'll be getting all of that in a nice, tasty package, and you can engage with it in a time and space that feels right for you, where it won't be overwhelming, but instead it'll be an opportunity to try something new and start this healing journey or continue on it. So thank you, everybody, and I'll pass it over to Fran to close us out.
Just want to say thank you to the Tension Watch Network for this space, for all the logistical work, for the promotion, and to all of you who joined us today. Please check out detentionwatchnetwork.org, LatinxTherapistActionNetwork.org. Follow us on social media. We're here for you. And support the Free Them All campaign to get our people out of the cages. We love you.
Also, stay in touch, y'all. We all exist in the world. Everyone's doing amazing work, for sure. Just share all you got with us.